Welcome to the Trees and Lines podcast, where we discuss fresh perspectives on utility vegetation management with your hosts, Phil and Tej. Don't forget to follow along on LinkedIn for the latest news. Now, let's dive into this week's episode. Welcome to another episode of Trees and Lines. Today, we are pleased to welcome a rural industry leader, one that's been around. I think I first met Rick Johnstone in 1979 or 80. Can't quite remember, Rick. Welcome.
It's good to be here, Phil. And yeah, it was way back then. I started in the industry in 1977, pretty much fresh out of college, out of West Virginia University. I graduated December of 76 and then started with Allegheny Power, which was Monongahela Power in Fairmont, West Virginia in April of 77. So that was my first introduction to utility arboriculture.
So Rick came out of West Virginia, I came out of West Virginia, and I'm guessing the first 200 utility veg managers came out of West Virginia.
Yeah, and I think that was all due to Dr. Kenneth Carvel, because he knew that utilities needed foresters. And I mean, I remember him taking us up on Cheat Mountain and showing us how to do backpack spraying, and the utilities are going to need to do that. And he gave us a better idea than going to work for a paper company or the U.S. Forest Service or that type of thing. So
yeah. So Rick, you did something very unusual for the time. You jumped from an electric utility position to your own enterprise. So tell us a little bit about IVM Partners and then what was behind that decision.
Okay, well, IVM Partners, I saw the need for that actually all the way back when I was with West Virginia, because with Monongahela Power back in the late 70s, through the mountains, they mostly relied on aerial treatment by helicopter. And I noticed that when they treated, of course, they take the trees out that could cause an outage. But the mountain laurel, the rhododendrons with the thick wax coating on their leaves, they would get the leaves burned back a little bit, but they wouldn't die. So you ended up with the shrubs there. And I thought, well, if you followed up a couple years after the aerial treatment with a ground touch-up to keep things from coming back in, you could just manage as a shrub community. Of course, back then they didn't have the money. They said, no, every 5 years we're coming through with a helicopter, and that's about all we're going to do. But then I left in December of 79 and started with Delmarva Power. At Delmarva, as I started changing the plant community from trees where they've been hand cutting and mowing for years, and we started managing and incorporating herbicides, I started seeing rare orchids coming back in, things that hadn't been there. And I worked with the state biologist. I called up the heritage program in Annapolis, Maryland, and I said, there was nothing here but maples, sweet gum, pines, 15, 20 feet tall. And I said, we treated with a helicopter, then we came in to touch up on the ground, and I'm seeing all these white fringed orchids. Where are they coming from? And they asked if they could come down. So I took them and showed it to them, and they said, well, we're finding out that some of these plants can lie dormant up to 150 years. He goes, the Native Americans on the coastal plain of Delmarva set the woods on fire about every year to drive game. That's how they hunted. And so they used fire. You basically duplicated fire with herbicides. And so those plants are lying dormant, waiting for that open meadow to come back. And as soon as it did, they germinated. And so then I showed EPA that, and because they were talking about restricting any use of herbicides around green pitcher plants. And one of the foresters who was one of my mentors with West Penn Power, Pete Spangler. Pete called me up and he said, hey, EPA is talking about something that they don't know what you're doing. So he sent me the article where they were talking about restricting herbicides. So I called up the EPA and I said, hey, we're managing the green pitcher plant for the Nature Conservancy. And we use herbicides. And they said, would you come to DC and talk to us? So you're going back to the old 35 millimeter slides, And I went to DC and they had what they called a brown bag lunch meeting where they had all their different departments, and I went over it. So then EPA said, can we come over and look at it? So I showed them. So then I ended up getting a good rapport with agencies and recognizing that we know what we're doing. We need to tell them what works and what doesn't, because they're sitting in DC and they make bad decisions if they're behind the desk and never come out. And that got me thinking about, I need to work with agencies. I need to not run away when somebody says, well, what are you doing? And not be afraid to say, we're using herbicides, we're incorporating them. So there was a talk show on the radio in Salisbury, Maryland, which is the middle of Delmarva. And a friend called me up. He said, they're talking about you guys on the radio. So I turned it on, and sure enough, they're thanking us for planting wildflowers. So I called in. I said, well, I'm the forester for Delmarva. And they said, well, we really appreciate what you're doing. You're planting all these wildflowers. It looks so beautiful. I said, well, thank you. I said, but we're not planting anything. She goes, well, what are you doing? I said, we're spraying herbicides. Well, when you're on the radio, there's a 10-second delay. It went that whole 10 seconds because she didn't know how to respond. And finally she said, well, that's nice. Can you come on the program and explain it? So I ended up going on the program 3 times. And that type of interplay with the media, with agencies, made me realize that if you really want to do this job right, you can't feign away. You need to really engage with people and know your trade and be willing to go against it. So kind of like getting to the IVM Partners, how that came about is working with the agencies. I was part of a vegetation management task force for Edison Electric Institute. And Lynn Grayson with American Electric Power back then, we co-chaired putting together the plan for EEI. And we were trying to come up with an agreement with all the federal agencies on how to manage. And I had been working with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation on Phragmites control, which is the invasive giant reed grass in the marshes in the Delaware estuary. And from that, I had a good rapport with them. So when we're in DC and we're meeting with all the agencies, we're not getting anywhere. And I thought, we got to do something else. So I went to Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I said, look, I've gone back and forth with EPA, with the other agencies. We need somebody to act as a liaison that knows the utilities want to do this, the agencies want to do that. How do you work together? You got to negotiate. You can't just butt heads, because utilities would never talk to agencies unless they needed a permit for a new project, or they did something wrong and now they're being called on the carpet.
Oh, interesting.
Neither one is helpful for getting good dialogue, So they said, well, we like that idea. This is Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They said, but if you want any chance of getting grants, you need to make it nonprofit. So from all of that, I took people who I knew from agencies that had retired. I went to universities like Jim Cabasso at Michigan State University, and I put together a board of directors and formed IVM Partners as a 501c3 in Delaware. And that was in 2003. IVM Partners was, I'll look at the area and I know what we need as a utility. And then I get a botanist outside and I go, okay, here's what's pretty much what we have to deal with. Let's take a transect here, 10 by 30 meters, key out every plant in here and the percent cover. Then we come in and say, instead of mowing, now we're doing selective herbicide treatments. And then we document how it changes. And that's how that got going.
Rick, here's a question for you. So amazing. Like I actually very interested in the evolution of this, but let's come back to that for a second. So fast forward, is IVM Partners, where is it at its maturity now? Like, today, IVM Partners exists, right?
Right.
Talk to us about the organization, and from that point to today, your reach, your focus, and how you feel about, the aggregate impact that IVM Partners, like, was this the right decision in hindsight? Or were you, have you ever thought about, like, well, what would I have stayed if I stayed at Delmarva, or maybe I moved to the other utilities? And were you able to impact more on the outside, or do you think you would have done more if you had stayed and done the utility round table?
Um, well, if I stayed with utility, um, or if I went with a contractor, I had contractors trying to get me to come on
Sure.
their side of the fence. Okay. I probably would have made more money,
Right.
but my motivation was we're wasting a lot of time. There are millions of acres in rights of ways. Okay. And I thought, I know what works, what doesn't. I've got a good rapport with agencies. I'm pretty good with the communication aspect. This is the calling that I need to go after. When I got to Michigan, they were topping trees in the metro parks that go around Detroit.
Yeah.
And I remember one big one, which is up in Oakland County, Stony Creek Metro Park. And they had topped the trees. And I went to the contractor. I said, why'd you guys top the trees? They said, well, we never remove trees in a park. I said, did you talk to the superintendent? They said, no. So I met with the superintendent and I said, hey, we can't keep this up because this is a 345,000 volt line. We can't lose this line. So he and I walked together and we're in the wintertime and you could see all these trees topped. Well, he'd only walk there in the summer when it's all in leaves. So you couldn't see the top trees. He said, I didn't know it looked like this. I said, this is junk. I said, what do you really want? He said, well, this used to be an oak savanna. This is where the glaciers came down and they dumped the talus here. And I said, we can get you an oak savanna minus the oaks
Yeah.
in the transmission line, but we could get you the prairie. And I said, but we need to clear these. We need to use some herbicides. He said, go ahead.
Yeah.
And so again, I said, well, I'm going to document it. And so we did, and we were able to show them how many plants came back. We ended up getting Blanding's turtle, which I didn't know was a rare turtle until I went and met with Michigan DNR and showed them what we were doing in the metro parks. And they said, the head of DNR from Michigan said, where'd you see that turtle at? I said, Stony Creek Metro Park in the wetland. He goes, that's a rare turtle. That's a Blanding's turtle. He said, how did it get there? I said, well, we got rid of the trees and now it's a wetland meadow again. Same thing in the upland. Mm-hmm. We started bringing native prairie grass, big blue stem coming back. Yeah. And he said, all of a sudden, I kicked out a covey of quail. The superintendent said, where'd you see quail? And I said, where we sprayed herbicides. He goes, we haven't had quail in 8 years. I said, you haven't had habitat.
Yeah.
Build it and they'll come. So those things, I just kept doing it. So
yeah. Where you are, like, so, a big thing that I'm hearing from you and something that I've learned, through Phil and in this industry is a lot of this is not just executing something. There's an education piece, right? There's a big part of the market, buyers, utilities, right, that maybe historically have not had the deepest of understanding of how IVM, UVM can be incorporated as more of an asset management strategy rather than just a cost center, right? That is a theme that I have seen all over the place. And so with your breadth of experience, knowledge, and actually seeing things from private consulting to the nonprofit side, and then also time with utility, where do you think we are in the US in terms of a true adoption of IVM? Like, hey, like if there's 100 critical sized utilities in the marketplace, 90% of them understand exactly the strategy and they're executing it at the level that you would feel is like to a standard. Like, where do you think we are on a macro level?
Might talk to us about it by sector, Rick.
Yeah, I would probably flip that to more of a 10% actually understand it. I think we still have too much of people bastardizing the term IVM. Okay. You'll get companies that are just mowing and they go, well, we're doing an IVM program. And I go, well, that's one step. Okay. or they'll come in and they'll do some spraying, and they won't communicate with the parks and thing. And I go, look, part of IVM is communication. Okay, you need a vegetation management plan. You're going to go certain steps. If the vegetation's too tall, I'm not going to come in and spray it unless you can do something like a helicopter, but if it's
Right.
real tall, I'll say, no, come in and mow it first. That is one.
Right.
Okay.
So simplify it for the audience and for us.
Okay.
What are the general principles of it? Like in your mind, there's variance in what you can do, but in order for an IVM program to exist, IVM should include A, B, C, D. What are those things that you feel are the pillars?
Okay. I would say if it's overgrown, okay, you need to cut it. So you may have to hand cut and mow. All right. That's
Okay.
have to, but then give it one growing season and now come back and do a herbicide treatment. Now, if it's dominated by invasive shrubs, okay, when we did up in Metro Park in Willow Metro Park, it was European buckthorn everywhere. Well, that's an invasive shrub. So we did an ATV and we broadcast treated where it was. Then we came back with backpacks and touched up the next year. So I'll tell people, look, cut it if it's too big, then do a herbicide treatment. If it's dense with what you don't want, it could be a broadcast. If it's not, be selective. Within 2 years of that, touch it up, because number one, you're not going to get everything with one herbicide or one treatment. Nobody's that good. And then two, you don't want it to revert back again quickly. So get it under control. And then, depending on the growing seasons you have, manage it, keep coming back and keep looking at it, and let the right of way determine when you come back. I've run into this where companies will say, we're doing IVM, we're on a 5-year program. And I'll go, the hell you are. The vegetation will tell you where you are. You don't sit in your office and say, well, we're waiting until 2030. You know what I mean?
Is that, and I've heard that, not I've heard, I know about this term. So, Rick, would that be what you would then consider the condition-based side of the critical thinking
Yes.
element, not necessarily just married to time?
No, not IVM. You can't be just married to time. You need to be flexible. And when I converted, I'll go back to Delmarva. When I converted that, I spent money to get that under control. Once I got certain things under control, then I shifted the dollars where I needed them. Okay. And so you don't want where you come in and especially the upper brass, like we talked a little bit about ice storm down in Tennessee. If you don't have enough money to do the program right, you can't ever get over that hump. Okay. What the upper brass needs to understand at utilities, put enough money in to get it under control, but the forester needs to say, here's the plan. And then once you start getting it under control, you're going to save money. Now, we did this with Enable Midstream, which is natural gas pipelines down in Arkansas and Missouri. They were mowing every 3 years. We got them started to manage. Now they didn't have to mow. Within 2 years of us starting it, they were saving $500,000 a year. So they then took that money and started reclaiming what we call orphaned pipelines, where they had gone too long. You got to come in and reclaim the right of way, completely reclaim it. You lost it. You might find the pipe in there, but you can't really do maintenance. You can then start cleaning those up so that you get your whole utility under control. So it's having a long-term vision of what you want to do, and understand that you're managing ecosystems. You're not just coming in to be able to trim trees or work on wires or work on pipes. You're going to manage that ecosystem to be compatible with what you're doing. Once you get it under control, now you take advantage of the biological controls, because plants are fighting for that growing space. Animals are consuming the seeds, birds, voles, field mice that are going to be seeding. Seeds are always falling into that right away. So you never are done. Let's say that. Well, you end up being managed, but you got to stay after it.
Just shifting gears for a second. Um, you've obviously seen federal administrations change, right? Like,
Mhm.
over your time. How much, because of a lot of what you're talking about and a lot of my understanding of how you've described IVM is there's a thoughtfulness to it that is, considering things like species, et cetera. It's a very intellectual and very intelligent approach to this whole thing. And then there's the alternative side, which is, hey, I've got to be efficient and I'm just going to mow everything down. I don't care how it looks, and I just need to make sure there's no risk to the wire, right?
Right.
There's these very extreme ways. How much of that philosophy shifts as we move through different presidential cycles? Like, does like utilities as they move into different expectations, in terms of managing electricity prices, etc. You know, and how are they influenced by federal leadership? Have you seen any relationship or correlation in watching utilities change their strategy as expectations of government changes?
Yeah, and it goes. Some of the things that we've lost some stuff because of agent administrations trying to control it. Okay, so
Oh,
like
okay.
they
Oh,
pick
interesting.
winners and losers. An example: I remember working with um, a nuclear power plant over in Iowa, and they were going to be shutting down the generators because they couldn't compete, even though it was nuclear, with solar and stuff. This is during the Obama administration
Yep.
because they were subsidizing solar and wind. And then the last administration subsidized solar and wind big time. And now the Trump administration's switching gears and saying, we're not subsidizing that anymore. So
Right.
now I'm seeing, because we're doing IVM work with wind power, solar power. Okay.
Okay.
I'm working with Apex Clean Energy in North Carolina and Virginia with
Okay.
solar and wind. They have the same issues. When you have a wind turbine, they can't allow anything to grow higher than 16 feet under that turbine blade. You've got transmission, you've got roadside, you've got pipelines, right? You've got um, for wind. I told them where they come in on the road, they had to cut down trees to be able to get that wind turbine blades in enough room because they swing. I
Yep.
said, well, you had to go to Fish and Wildlife and determine, are there any bats before you could cut down the trees? I said, well, what if you needed to put a replacement blade in there?
Hmm.
How are you going to get in? Well, we got to use the same road. I said, well, if you let the trees grow up, you got to go wait and do permits again, right? And they said, yeah. I
Hmm.
said, so why don't we manage those corners with
Hmm.
IVM and manage them to a shrub community?
Hmm.
You'll have better habitat, and you're not going to have to deal with that again down the road. That's going to cost you a lot of money.
Yep.
So when you start looking at what different utilities need, whether that's wind, solar, electric, gas,
Yep.
oil, highways, a right of way is a right of way. It's just what are you trying to manage? And the other thing is working with the agencies is that if you get to the realization, we all work for the public. We're
Yeah.
providing services to the public, or
That's
we're
right.
providing habitat that the public wants, the visual that they want, the aesthetics, be able to see birds, be able to see wildlife. And if you can meet those needs by adjusting how you do it, that's really the beauty of IVM is you're not locked into one thing.
Yeah. Right.
You're you're looking at it in a holistic approach and saying,
Yeah.
what can I do to meet that need
Yes.
as I'm meeting my need?
Yeah.
And
No,
the
that's
economics
great.
and the benefits have been so well documented for
Right.
Yeah.
4 decades, maybe longer, I don't know,
Yeah.
but just so consistent.
And I didn't really do anything different. What I did when I was at Delmarva is take what was built on by giants like Dr. Bramble and Dr. Burns on Game Lands 33, and I incorporated it. We've laid it out. If you learn what we teach at the different meetings and what's written and incorporate that into the program, it's set up for you. It's just a matter of being able to argue those points with the financial people at the companies. Okay.
Yep. Yep.
That's the communication part. You got to be able to tell the story to those who don't understand this stuff.
Where are you today in your career? What do you want to how do you want to memorialize your body of work over time? Like, is IVM something that, eventually somebody else will run? Like how, you've had it sounds like such a unique impact on this industry. And, we do this, right? We chat with a lot of people. This conversation has been a little bit different because you seem to have tackled this from the agency side and all the other groups that have an impact on how things get done, but no one always really talks about. They're just kind of like, well, the agency will do this. And it seems like you've brought a bunch of stakeholders in a room and gotten the broader market on the same page. Like, where do you go from here? What is
usually
Sorry, go ahead, Phil.
Usually agencies are talked about as an insurmountable hurdle.
Right.
They're part of the equation.
Right. They're part of the equation. Exactly. That's very unique. I've never heard of that.
They're part of the equation. And what I learned from them is what their restrictions are. Okay. Like, well, let me answer your question. Going forward, I mean, we still have a board of directors. We've got nine people who advise us. I've had other people say, "Hey, I'd like to do this. I'd like to work with you." I mean, I'm in my 70s now, and my botanist is in his mid 70s. So we're still doing it. We try not to get another one like we did with TC Energy up and down 45-degree slopes in West Virginia, because that's getting a little tough to do. But
you're still in it.
Still in it. And in fact, last year we started doing projects, documenting for CPKC Railroad in Kansas City, because most of the railroads will use tank trucks to broadcast spray. And CPKC said, we need to start looking at sustainability. What about the monarch butterfly? What about bees? So we're still expanding on what we're doing. We've worked in probably half the states of the union, from Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. I'd like to see that people take this to look at other aspects, such as we've done cheatgrass control documentation in Colorado. Yeah. One application on cheatgrass, and you could take it out and all the native prairie grasses and wildflowers come back. Yeah. When you look at wildfires out in California, their number one grass is cheatgrass. It's no different what I saw in Hawaii, with the buffalo grass. If you controlled that, if you put in fire breaks, if you made sure that they were actually fire breaks. When you get into the western states, when we worked in Arizona, New Mexico, you managed to low-growing, cool-burning plants. Now your right-of-way can act as a fire break. You got an area where the hotshot crews can be dropped off to backfire and stop a wildfire by cooperating. When we took over Atlantic City Electric, when I was at Delmarva, I got with the New Jersey Forest Fire Service, because they get some pretty hot fires in the Pine Barrens. Yep. And I said, look, we've got transmission lines. I'll share my maps with you so you know where they are, so you know how to get in there, so you could stop fires. Mm-hmm. He said, what do you want? I said, well, we need to patrol these lines. He goes, well, I have a helicopter. You buy the gas, I'll bring the ship. Let me fly, we'll fly together. Right. So the head of the Forest Service was the pilot, he was flying the lines, looking at where they needed to go, while I'm looking at the lines. What do we need to do for vegetation management? That's that scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of thing.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
sure.
And we both can do a better job at cheaper price, and we're
Yeah.
both working for the public. So
Yeah.
it's just a common sense approach, really.
Yeah.
It's
Look, I
nothing-
mean, you've really defined partnership and public, right? Like you have figured out how to build the right partnerships to solve a problem, keeping the public's interests, right in front of you. And I think that you should be commended for that. Like you've done, Phil's
Well, and
obviously
it
told me a lot
pays
about you.
off. When we did work with Baltimore Gas and Electric, all right, and that was U.S. Fish and Wildlife asking me to help them.
Mhm.
Well, once we showed what we could do on a transmission line near Annapolis, the wildlife refuge at Patuxent, which is outside of D.C., said, well, we'd like you to come down here, but we don't want you to mow it because it masticates everything. Can you come down and just start managing? Well, they used to have to hire a botanist from Fish and Wildlife to say, okay, you could cut this tree or you could cut that tree and go on 200 acres like that. And instead, we were able to come in there and convert it back over, but incorporate what they needed. They need to control mile-a-minute weed. That doesn't bother utility, but it bothers habitat. We know what herbicides will control it. We said, well, we'll take and we'll help you out while we do what we need to do. You know what I mean? And when you have the science and you have the ability to do it, you can make life much easier for those you need to work with.
Yes.
Yeah. Rick, you're a passionate advocate.
You are a passionate
I
advocate.
like it. Yeah.
Rick, Rick, we could talk to you indefinitely. So, but we're bumping up on time here, but look, Rick, this is a very unique conversation. You have an extremely unique perspective. Obviously I've had a lot of incredible impact on this broad industry. I think there's obviously still a lot to do. I think your message is incredible. So let's try to find some time to kind of do a second episode and build on some of the things, or focus on some of the specifics that you had kind of laid out for us today. I think it's pretty interesting, especially the way you've structured nonprofit, a consulting arm, agencies. I'd like to talk more maybe on another episode about specifically diving into the agency side of things. So this is great. Thank you for making time.
Yeah.
Hey, my pleasure. My pleasure.
This is awesome.
Rick. Thanks for joining us today. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates and to tune in again to the Trees and Lines podcast.